Hey guys, thanks for coming back and joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back. So, in today's episode, we're going to go through some common logical fallacies, how you can spot them, and just how to kind of make sure that when you're talking to somebody, that you don't get kind of drugged down the wrong road by what are largely either flawed logic or emotional arguments. There's nothing wrong with emotional arguments, and emotional arguments don't necessarily invalidate facts. That more than one thing can be true at the same time. But just from a purely using your head and thinking logically, I think it's important to kind of understand some of the fallacies or misconceptions, incorrect ways to logically work through an argument. And so we're going to cover some of those today and just talk through them. So, yeah, that's where we're going to start. So, number one is the straw, excuse me, the straw man fallacy. So that's when someone oversimplifies or misrepresents your argument to make it easier to attack or refute. In essence, you're arguing this. They set up a straw man argument over here, and that kind of drags everyone off, and it makes it look like they've refuted your argument when they haven't. So, an example on this: you hear a lot of talk about Second Amendment and I want gun rights and I want gun control. So if someone says, "Look, I support the Second Amendment," and the person arguing against him says, "Well, then you want kids to die because if we don't change gun control, then kids are going to die." That may or may not be true. You don't have any evidence of that, but that's not what the argument was. The argument was not about kids dying from gun violence. The argument was about Second Amendment rights. And so they've set up an argument over here to draw you away from this argument over here, the actual argument that was taking place. So it's very common to see that happen. It happens both ways. You could make the same argument the other way on the Second Amendment. So if someone says, "I support common sense gun control," and someone says, "Well, you just want to take away everyone's guns," that's not what they said. They said they support common sense gun control, and you set up a straw man over here to try to argue against it. So you got to watch out for the straw man fallacy. It's very easy to get drug off into the wrong direction and wind up talking about something that really has nothing to do with what you started talking about, what you started arguing about. So, yeah, that's number one. Another one is called the bandwagon fallacy. And the bandwagon fallacy is, well, if a whole bunch of people believe that it's true, well, then it's got to be true. And look, COVID was rampant with these. Masking saves lives. Actually, no, it didn't. There's tons of data now that shows masking had zero effect on the transmission of COVID or the mortality rate of people that contracted COVID. But because a bunch of people thought it was true and a bunch of people felt passionate about it, we actually got to a point where you couldn't even talk about it and it became political, which is wild. Um, but the bandwagon fallacy, it's you got to watch out for that. It's very popular in politics. It's very popular in just kind of public opinion. We did an episode uh, previously where we talked about the McDonald's hot coffee incidents, or sorry, the McDonald's hot coffee incident, and the woman that was injured during that incident. And when you started pulling apart what people thought happened versus what actually happened, it looked very different. And the bandwagon fallacy has the ability to make that happen as well. So you got to be careful of that. Another one, logical fallacy, is appeal to authority. So I'm going to reference an authority. Usually it's a specific person or a specific agency and say, because this authority says it is so, it has to be so. Well, not true. It could be true. It doesn't have to be true, unless that argument is supported by a lot of verifiable statistics. That doesn't make it true, and it could be very anecdotal. There also could be an outlier, and you see this a lot. I see it on the illegal immigration argument a lot. So I'm not for illegal immigration. I think immigration should be a lot easier than it is in our country, but there also needs to be a vetting process by which we know who's coming in. But there should be a pathway for people to participate in our society, to pay taxes, to use the services in our system, but you shouldn't be rewarded for jumping the line either. So we have to have some type of order to it. With all that said, um, the I'm an authority because I was impacted by crime by an illegal alien. Okay, well that's your experience, but there's 335 million people in our country, so we can't use just your experience to say, well, there, that shows you that all illegal immigration is terrible. That's just not true. You can't conclude one from the other. And so that appeal to authority. I'm an authority because it happened. I'm a doctor. Look, they call the person that graduated last in their class at medical school, they call them doctor. And I'm not taking shots at doctors, it's a statement of fact. Math will tell you that half of the doctors that practice are below average because that's what an average is. It's right in the middle. So half the people are below it, and half the people are above it. So just because someone has credentials doesn't make them an expert, doesn't make them right all the time. And even if they're really good at what they do, they can make mistakes, they can make errors. So you can't rely on someone just because there's authority. I will talk a little bit further down because when there's a whole bunch of evidence from a whole bunch of experts, yeah, that's a very compelling argument. But simply calling an appeal to authority, or I'm an X, whatever X is, a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, uh, a contractor, it doesn't mean you know what you're talking about. Next, false dilemma fallacy. So this is where you create. There are only two options. There's no middle ground. So um, if we don't do X, then the whole world's going to end. Well, there's probably lots of middle ground between the two, but you or whoever is making the argument wants to create an either or proposition with the other side being as unattractive as possible. You hear this a lot, like on the climate change. If we don't make changes right now, the world's going to end in 12 years. The climate will get to a point that it's so bad, it's irreversible, and it'll never recover. Well, okay, well, we started as a planet that was filled with volcanoes, it was uninhabitable. And over a long period of time, the planet cooled and the climate changed, and here we are. So, yeah, that's just not true. There's not an either or. There's probably a middle ground in there somewhere that makes sense, but it's a false dilemma that's being created to try to push an agenda, and you can't fall for those types of arguments. You've got to push back on those arguments. Next, the hasty generalization fallacy. So you get a little bit of information and you make broad, sweeping conclusions based on that generalization, or you have a little bit of evidence and you apply that evidence across a much larger sample size incorrectly. And so we saw that happen a lot during COVID as well. So, when the original cases of COVID that we had in the United States were at a nursing home in Washington. And when you look at the nursing home population, look at that population. So it's elderly, a bunch of comorbidities. They basically stay indoors. They don't have the best ventilation in those areas, and they interact with each other a lot. So it's kind of the perfect storm for a highly transmittable respiratory disease to be transmitted around the population. So apply that to the rest of the country. Well, the rest of the country doesn't fit that population. The the nursing home population skewed much older, was indoors most of the time. A lot of times people are not indoors. There was no kids involved. Or there was nothing around gender or comorbidities. We took a little bit of information and applied it across the rest of the country, and it's just a terrible logical fallacy to commit. So that's the best example I could think of when I was reading through these fallacies. Now, there's the flip side of that, the slothful induction fallacy. You have people that refuse to accept overwhelming evidence that proves or is strongly suggests, is probably a better way to say it, strongly suggests a particular outcome. And so the slothful induction fallacy is, well, I need to be 100% certain. Well, no, you don't. Really, you can draw some conclusions based on this overwhelming amount of evidence that we have. And I will say here that the larger a data set you work off of, generally the better and more concrete conclusions you can draw from that data set. So the more information you have, the more accurate the conclusions you're able to draw from it is the way to think about that. So there's that one. So correlation versus causation. The correlation versus causation fallacy. My favorite way to explain this one, just because there was a cartoon when I was a kid that had this. So the rooster crows at 6 o'clock every morning, and then the sun comes up. So it must be the rooster crowing that makes the sun come up. That's not true. They both happen around the same time, but one is not the cause of the other. So you have to be careful of that, because two things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. Could be, could not be. Doesn't mean they have to be, doesn't mean they are not. But without some verifiable evidence that one causes the other, you can't jump to that conclusion. And some of this stuff's gray, it just is. But from a logical, using your brain to think logically perspective, you should be able to spot that and say, hey, just because these two things happen around the same time or seem to happen around the same time does not make one the cause of the other, is the right way to think about that. Anecdotal evidence fallacy. So it's similar to some of the other fallacies, but you take a little bit of evidence, like we used earlier in the conversation, we used uh, illegal immigration, and someone had a bad experience with an illegal immigrant, therefore it must all be bad. That there's not enough evidence there to support that. You need enough evidence to support those arguments. Um, in order to draw those conclusions. So you got to be careful about hastily drawing conclusions based on a little bit of evidence. The next one I really like, just because of the name of it and the concept, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So let's just say for a second you go out and you take a bunch of shots at the side of a barn. And then after you take all these shots, you find the one area where there was a good concentration of shots and you draw a target there. And you say, look, this is evidence of what a good sharpshooter I am. But you ignore all the other areas of the side of the barn that you hit. They're nowhere near that target. And so it's essentially cherry picking data. It's using um, statistics in a dishonest way, or using data in a dishonest way to try to draw conclusions or get people to accept your argument. And you got to be careful of that. It's very easy for people, it's a very common way for people to try to make their argument. I think this is what, when you think about, I can't remember the doctor's name that kind of first surfaced the argument around vaccines and autism that was widely discredited after the fact. He cherry picked a bunch of data, and I think he falsified some of it too, but he cherry picked a bunch of data to kind of prove that his hypothesis was true, ignoring all the other data that that ran counter to his hypothesis. So you have to be very careful of that. But Texas sharpshooter fallacy. I love the name. I think it's pretty straightforward from the way I explained it. So, middle ground fallacy. So the middle ground fallacy says, hey, when you have two extreme examples, there's got to be a middle ground that makes sense. Well, maybe there is, maybe there's not. But sometimes when there's two extreme opponents, one of them is right and one of them is wrong. That's always an option or an opportunity. Just because two groups are diametrically opposed doesn't mean they're both way off their rocker and there's some middle ground that makes sense. So you got to be careful of that. Simply because there's two really contrary opinions or contrary arguments doesn't necessarily mean that one of them isn't 100% right and one of them isn't 100% wrong. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But simply because they're diametrically opposed doesn't mean there's a middle ground somewhere that makes more sense. You got to be careful of that. Burden of proof fallacy. So this one's a little bit tricky. You definitely want people to provide evidence before you're willing to sign off on their hypothesis. However, simply because they don't provide evidence when they make their argument doesn't mean that their argument is wrong. It very well could be true, and they don't have good evidence to support it. They're not good at articulating the evidence to support it. There's lots of reasons why they might not have the evidence up front. But simply because they present the argument without evidence doesn't mean that that argument is not true. So I think it's always good to ask for verification or do your own research or verify arguments that are made. But simply because an argument is made without evidence doesn't mean that it's not true. And you saw this a lot with Trump when he was president. President Trump said, without evidence, well, like Russiagate, there's a lot. Turns out that whole thing was made up. Came from a dossier that was paid for by a political opponent. And the whole thing for 3 years, we listened to Russia, 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 and it was false. So, but people didn't like it because it was Trump. So without evidence, you heard that a lot. Without evidence, without evidence. And then there's other times where he was absolutely just lying. So without evidence, yeah, there is no evidence because he's making it up. So that's a good example of just because it's there is not proof provided when the argument is made that the argument is invalid. It also doesn't make it valid. So you have to be careful there. Personal incredulity fallacy. So that is because you, as the receiver of the argument, find it difficult to comprehend or difficult to wrap your mind around. It has to be false. So that's just because you don't want to believe it or you can't understand it. Doesn't mean that it's not true. It also doesn't mean it's true. But that argument of that's crazy, that's ridiculous. You hear that a lot when people dismiss what they consider conspiracy theories. Well, there's been a certain number of conspiracy theories that have been floated out there as conspiracy theories that are true. Hunter Biden's laptop, a good example. So, like, immediately, there were people that were like, there's no way that the president's son takes his computer into this place and it's got pictures of him doing drugs and hanging out with hookers and uh, hugely problematic texts and emails. There's no way that's all true. Well, it turns out it was absolutely true, 100% true. But because people didn't want to believe it or found it hard to believe, they dismissed it. Logical fallacy. And look, there was people that wanted to believe it too. I can't remember what the Pizzagate thing is, right? Some like child molestation or like we're running some type of child trafficking ring through pizza places. Yeah, okay, right. So that doesn't make it true simply because um, it was presented. It doesn't make it false simply because it was presented because you can't believe it. There's the no true Scotsman fallacy. Again, that's a great name. But, that is one that I say, hey, Americans love their country. And you say the U.S. women's national soccer team um, they're all American and they have problems with their country. Well, no true American would have those problems. Well, that's a logical fallacy. They're absolutely American. They have every right to make the arguments that they make and support the causes that they support. Everyone else has a right to disagree with them or agree with them as the case may be. But simply because someone states that no true or a real American wouldn't think that, it's just not a good argument. It's a logical fallacy, holds no merit, holds no weight, and you got to be careful both ways on that. That you can't give someone credit simply because they're in the real Americans or the no true Scots or the true Scotsman, or that's un-American or no real American would do that. Neither of those work. You got to be careful both of those. Ad hominem, an ad hominem attack is just basically attacking the person. So like Trump does this a lot. Like it's very annoying to me when he does that. Like are there times where it's funny? Sure, there's times where it's funny, but you'd expect more from the person that wants to run our country. That instead of personal attacks, he would talk about policy. Now, if you're attacking someone's character because you don't think they be a good judge of character or make good decisions because of their character, like I get that, that's legit. But he's fat or he's ugly or he's dumb, like that. Those are not good logical arguments. Those are ad hominem attacks. Tu quo Q fallacy. That it's Latin for you also. Tu quo Q. It's a type of an ad hominem attack where it essentially calls out the hypocrisy of someone because they're arguing something that runs counter to how they behave. That doesn't make it less true. So let's just say I'm a smoker and I argue about all the smoking, why smoking is bad, and the statistics around smoking. And someone says, Well, don't you smoke? Yes, but that doesn't make my arguments any less valid. So that smoking is bad and it's unhealthy and people should try not to. Simply because someone points out the hypocrisy of a particular person in a particular situation doesn't mean that they're wrong. Doesn't mean that their argument is not valid. It's a type of an ad hominem attack, and it's not good logic when you're arguing stuff. And then the last one, which is one of my favorites, is the fallacy. So simply because someone's logic is flawed in the argument that they make doesn't mean that their argument might not ultimately be true. That doesn't mean you have to accept it. Doesn't mean you can't challenge them on the fallacy in their logic. But don't forget that what they're arguing for, or the point that they're arguing, might actually be real. It might actually be true. So simply because their argument or the approach that they take to argue it stinks, doesn't mean that that point is not true. So I love logic. I love debating. I love hearing people's points of views on things, how they support their points of views. It tells me a lot about how a person thinks. It tells me a lot about how they approach life. And so I try to encourage people to be logic based when they make arguments. I think you get further along. I think you become a better problem solver. I think it's a good way to go about things when you're thinking through how to deal with things in your life. So hope you guys found that useful. Obviously we had the kind of definitions and examples as we went through those, and hopefully you can refer to those and kind of keep honing up on your logic skills as you work your way through difficult situations. Don't forget to go to our website, saltygingertalk.com. We've got all of our content on there. All of our podcast episodes are there. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching us on there. If not, zip over there real quick and check us out. And then you can also sign up at our website for our newsletter. So thanks again, guys, for coming back and joining us. Everybody have a great day. We'll see you next time.